Five Nights at Freddy's has taken some wild twists and turns with its story, always throwing us for a loop, but early on we know that Scott Cawthon had a different idea of how the games would play out, the first four games being one story. Within that story, there were and still are an enormous amount of mysteries. A few of those biggest mysteries are still bugging us to this day, such as which animatronic caused the bite of 87, and what are these shadow animatronics? How did these strange shadow variations of the characters come to be? And in order to try and answer these things, we need to work with what we had at the time. At the time, we didn't have all the additional info we do now, and there wasn't room for Scott to retroactively fill in the gaps. But before we jump in, I first want to establish a few things. One, that Scott Cawthon loves to introduce something in one game, then officially establish it in the next game. For example, Elizabeth's room showing up in FNAF 4 leads into her full character introduction in Sister Location. Or how Vanessa Vanny is first teased in Help Wanted, but gets actual screen time, however little it is, in Security Breach. There are other examples I'd like to bring up as well, but I really don't want to make this video too long. The point being, I believe that originally, the Shadow Animatronics were added to the game for a similar purpose. That being, that FNAF 1 introduced the idea of the bite of 87, and FNAF 2 and onwards introduced the Shadow Animatronics to give us more of a greater understanding of what that bite meant for the series and the story, and we'll expand on that in a bit here. When FNAF 1 released, one of our first big lore drops was this idea of a bite that happened in 1987. Everyone was intrigued by this crazy bite, and it made us wonder, who caused this bite? Which animatronic did this deed? As the questions lingered in our mind, an additional mystery was presented to us in FNAF 2. All of a sudden, we had these mysterious shadow animatronics introduced to us, but with no explanation as to where they came from. They'd appear rarely and at random. To add to these already perplexing questions, by the time the fourth game was released, we learned of a second bite that happened in 1983. We now had two bites, but still didn't know the answer to who caused the bite of 87. But what do these bites actually matter? What was the point of any of this? And I think the answer was given to us over the course of FNAF 2 through 4. See, FNAF 1 established the idea and the mystery behind a bite taking place, while FNAF 2 had some follow-up questions about it, as well as what I think was a direct answer. It was just an answer that we wouldn't fully understand until the 4 games credits had rolled. To explain myself here, I think the Shadow Animatronic showing up in FNAF 2 was actually an answer as to what happens after a bite takes place. Scott was addressing the reason that the bite was significant. Like, sure, a bite happened in 1987. So what? Why was it significant though? Kids were stuffed into animatronic suits too, and this ends up being the core of the entire FNAF story in a sense. So if this type of event is crucial to the story, then it makes sense that the bites were important to the story as well. And you might argue that the significance of the bites was simply to give us dates for different important events in the timeline so that we can figure out when the Fazbear locations were shut down. But I think there's more to it than that. What Scott was doing here with these bites was not just giving us more juicy lore to ponder over, but he was giving us a critical piece we need to make a very important connection in FNAF. And FNAF 2 gave us a direct answer as to why the bite was so important. So let's break down that answer here. Essentially, how I see it, in Scott's mind, when a bite takes place, something supernatural happens. The act of an animatronic biting into a human creates a strange sort of ghostly character, in a similar way to how the children supernaturally possess the animatronics after death. The shadows are supernaturally created when a human is bitten by an animatronic. But that on its own isn't enough to make the connection I want to make here. So we need to examine how Scott tells his story in these games to gather a bit more evidence. Scott Cawthon puts a large emphasis on things like character color palette, whether that be ghosts being grayed out versions of kids, or text color changes signifying different characters. We also have important things like numbers, like how numbers correspond to children in events like the MCI, and secret codes on the wall. Other small details and environmental storytelling are huge in FNAF. And keeping this in mind, I find it interesting that we only have 2 shadow characters throughout the first 4 games. Now you could argue that the other crying shadows that we see in the FNAF 3 minigames are technically shadow animatronics as well, but the difference with those shadows versus these shadow animatronics is the color choice of the shadows. These minigame shadows are not purple in color, and we know that color choice in FNAF is highly important. With this, I want to remind you that both Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are shown as purple. Shadow Freddy being purple on the cameras when you brighten the image, and Shadow Bonnie isn't purple when you brighten the image, but Shadow Bonnie is purple in the minigame from FNAF 3. And I do understand that this could be simply due to the character being in shadow so that the animatronic is visible in the minigame, but I could also argue the same thing about William Afton being purple in the minigames and yellow in Midnight Motorist. And if that feels like a weak argument, I definitely get it. A lot of people still don't think Mustard Man even is William, and that's fair. So let's look at it this way instead. In the same way that Shadow Bonnie is introduced in FNAF 2, his character is then expanded upon in FNAF 3, giving us a better look at him and giving his character more purpose. Scott could have chosen any other bright color to represent him, but he chose purple specifically, which is already intriguing because William Afton is also purple, so Scott could have easily chosen a different color to represent this character, but he wanted us to tie this back to the shadow characters from FNAF 2. I can be persuaded to believe otherwise, but to me it does still seem intentional due to the other reasons I'm presenting, and the fact that Scott could have chose any other color. Colors matter in FNAF. This seems to be a clear indicator that something about these two characters is special, unique to only them. They're the only animatronics to have these creepy shadow variants. And at this point in the story, we only knew of two animatronics that had bitten humans before. Two shadows, two bites, two purple characters, so I definitely think that this was no coincidence. And if it's not a coincidence, we can finally answer who our bite instigators were. The obvious one being Freddy or Fredbear in 1983, but wait, if that's the 83 bite, who caused the bite of 87? The answer is obvious now. Seeing how the Shadow Freddy is a shadow of a Freddy or Fredbear, it only makes sense to conclude that since Shadow Bonnie is a literal shadow of Bonnie, but even more specifically is shaped just like Toy Bonnie, that Toy Bonnie was originally going to be the animatronic that caused the bite of 87. One more thing I want to mention here is that both shadows are based off of characters that were definitely present when the bites take place. We see the bite of 83, so it's easy to connect that animatronic to the shadow version of itself. And with Toy Bonnie being present at the location where the bite of 87 happens, it seems like a logical conclusion to assume that the same rule would apply here. The animatronic that bit the person is the animatronic we're going to see a shadow character of. And these shadows aren't without purpose either. They're not just there to fill in a question that we had. They clearly play a more important role in the story than just satisfying our curiosity. But I absolutely think that it was the case that the evidence was pointing us to these two characters originally being both the bite instigators as well as the reason for the shadows existing. The bites essentially creating this shadow. That doesn't sound satisfying though, does it? And I kind of agree with that, but I think that over time this has been retroactively changed since then. We never for sure did get an answer one way or the other, so it's perfectly possible that Scott decided to go a different route with the story after FNAF 4. I think that originally though these shadows were a way for Scott to show us who our bite instigators were, and that any further details about them would be revisited later on, which is something Scott loves to do. But by the time FNAF 4 ended, Scott changed his mind and wanted to make something more for his ever-growing fan base. He didn't think that we would accept the ending that he originally created for the story. And I think it's at that point that things started changing, and since he hadn't technically said one way or the other, that he now had the freedom to decide, we could make these shadows mean something more than this even. And so that's kind of where it seems like the story went from there. But I think originally we did have enough pieces here that we could put together where the shadow animatronics came from and why the bites mattered. Otherwise, it's like, who cares if there were bites? Like, yes, there's the crying child bite that seems quite significant with the putting you back together, but the 1987 bite didn't really matter. And the fact that it happened in the FNAF 2 location to me seems to point to the idea that originally we were able to solve it just from the information we had. Whether that holds up now, I don't know. So let me know what you think down below, and have a fabulous day.